Okay, so I want you to imagine a uh, a really pristine piece of hunting land. Now, this week, 5 hunters get access to it.
Right.
The next week, it's three totally different hunters. 2 weeks after that, four more show up. And then another group of three. Just constant
A
pressure.
revolving door.
Exactly, a revolving door. So stop and think about that for a second. It's that kind of chaotic, high-volume rotation.
Mm.
I mean, what does that do to the land?
And to the wildlife.
Yes, to the wildlife that calls it home and, ultimately to the experience for every single hunter involved. The answer we found in our sources today is, well, it creates unsustainable chaos. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to take what might seem like a really niche topic setting maximum hunter limits on hunting leases and show you that it's actually about these much larger concepts.
Yeah, we're talking about sustainable conservation and proper wildlife management.
The core idea we're unpacking is actually pretty straightforward. True hunters are conservationists. And the key to pairing that whole mindset with long-term land health is applying these crucial, professionally determined hunter limits.
And we're going to be looking at two really different models for this.
Right. The short-term leases, which, often just ignore limits to chase profit, and then the annual long-term leases, which are actually designed to implement them the right way.
And that's really where the whole conversation has to start. For a lot of people, leasing land might just sound like, I don't know, a basic real estate deal, like renting a cabin for the weekend.
Sure.
But the sources we looked at treat it as an essential conservation tool. If you manage it poorly, if you have no limits, it can be just devastating to the local ecosystem. But
Yeah.
if it's done right, it can ensure the health of that wildlife for decades.
Okay, so let's unpack that term you just used, the hunter conservationist, because that feels like the foundation for this whole argument.
Yeah.
What exactly does the source material mean by that, and how do limits fit into that identity?
What's really fascinating here is how the sources frame this. It's relational, not transactional.
Relational. Yeah.
Yeah. When we talk about a hunter conservationist, we're talking about someone who develops a real long-term invested relationship with a specific piece of land. They actually care about its health next year and the year after that.
So they have skin in the game long term.
Exactly. And when you pair that long-term connection with good management, the result is what the sources call great things for wildlife health and population stability.
And that relational approach, it stands in pretty stark contrast to the two leasing models you mentioned earlier. We're talking about what our source material literally calls the Airbnbs of hunting land, the short-term lease.
Yes. And that's a perfect analogy because that short-term model is almost exclusively focused on maximizing immediate revenue. Per weekend, per week.
Just getting bodies on the property.
Right. And the criticism in the sources is blunt. Because these rentals prioritize transaction volume, they often end up being the complete opposite of conservation. They just ignore the long-term impact.
Yeah, I can see that. If your whole business model is based on running, and I'm quoting here, group after group of hunters through an area, you have absolutely zero incentive to manage pressure or worry about next season's population.
None. You're just trying to maximize turnout this season.
That's it.
And that's precisely where the damage shows up. That lack of limits creates so much pressure that it effectively kills out and stresses the deer, the turkeys, all the wildlife to the point where they just leave or they get exhausted.
So the long-term annual lease is the alternative.
It's the direct contrast. It's designed to preserve the wildlife, to make sure management decisions are sustainable, and, ultimately to preserve the quality of the hunt. And that ensures the landowner actually benefits from the property's health in the long run. It shifts the whole focus from a quick transaction to sustainable income.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate here for a second. The short-term rental is all about that immediate cash flow. Does the source material really give a compelling reason for a landowner to pick limits and restrictions over that instant money?
It does, and the reason is quality, because sustainability translates directly into quality.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you completely decimate the population or you chase all the mature bucks off the property in year one because you had no limits, no serious hunter is going to pay top dollar to lease that same land in year two.
Ah, okay. The value of the asset itself degrades.
Precisely. The annual lease with limits preserves the asset, the quality of that hunting experience, which then guarantees high demand and reliable income over a decade, not just for one chaotic season.
That makes perfect sense. So if the goal is conservation, sustainability, and quality revenue, then we need to dig into the specific benefits of setting those limits. This is where we get to the core of the analysis. The source gives us 5 really specific, crucial benefits, and we should probably walk through them one by one.
Absolutely. These 5 reasons are, I think, the most important part of this whole deep dive. They connect all the dots between the hunter's experience, the biology of the herd, and even the landowner's liability.
Let's start with the one that feels most immediate, maybe the most subjective benefit. The hunter's experience. It's reason number one, preventing overcrowding.
Mm-hmm.
The source notes that for so many hunters, a huge part of the appeal of the outdoors is that it's a sanctuary.
An escape.
It's an escape from, the hustle and bustle of our busy culture. So when you finally get out to your leased land looking for that solitude, and you run into 3 or 4 other hunting parties you weren't expecting, it's just completely discouraging.
It defeats the entire purpose.
Right. It ruins the very reason you sought out the lease in the first place.
That psychological part is so critical. A proper limit system makes sure that the individual hunter feels like they have that space to themselves. They get that connection to nature. But once you establish that psychological sanctuary, we move into straight up biological necessity. And that brings us to reason number 2, avoiding overharvesting.
Okay, so this is where it gets more technical.
Yeah, this is where limits stop being about comfort and start being about the actual viability of the wildlife. Hosting too many hunters in one area is just a recipe for biological disaster. And the most obvious disaster is overharvesting game, which has a huge negative impact on key species like, white-tailed deer and wild turkeys.
And the source material got really specific on the damage done to whitetail populations, which is something we should probably explain for anyone who isn't, familiar with herd management.
It did, and this is where the conversation gets a little meaty. Overharvesting creates this sort of triple threat to the deer population's structure.
A triple threat.
The first threat is that it negatively impacts what's called buck age structures.
And what does that mean in simple terms?
It just means you're removing too many of the younger, mature bucks before they can reach their full biological potential. You need those older, bigger bucks to ensure genetic diversity, to compete for breeding rights. It just keeps the whole herd healthier.
So if you only have young bucks left, the whole herd starts to degrade over time.
Exactly. It's an ecosystem management problem, not just a numbers problem, and that leads directly to the second threat. It negatively impacts the buck-to-do ratio.
Right, the balance gets thrown off.
Severely. When too many bucks are harvested, you end up with way too many does for the few remaining bucks. This creates intense stress on those bucks during the rut, and it can lead to later fawning, less healthy breeding cycles. It's a whole cascade of problems.
And the third threat is the simplest one, I assume.
The simplest, yeah. It negatively impacts overall deer densities. Too many hunters just remove too many animals, period. The property becomes sparsely populated for future seasons.
Which goes directly against that whole hunter conservationist mindset we started with.
It's the ultimate example of sacrificing the long term for a quick, short-term gain.
Okay, that brings us to reason number 3. Maintaining hunting quality. Now, at first glance, this sounds a lot like what we just discussed with overharvesting. But the source makes a very clear distinction. Why are these two separate issues?
Because harvest is what you physically take out of the property, pressure is what you apply to the property, and that pressure changes animal behavior.
Ah, I see.
So even if, by some miracle, you didn't overharvest the animals, just having too many hunters on the landscape, too many trucks, too much scent, too many boots on the ground, that all adds up to intense hunting pressure. And deer, especially the mature ones, are incredibly sensitive to that kind of pressure. They don't just stand around waiting to be seen.
So what happens when that pressure gets too high?
They adapt, and they relocate. They become almost entirely nocturnal, only moving in the dead of night, which makes them nearly impossible to hunt ethically or successfully.
Or they just leave the property altogether.
Just as often, yeah. That pressure pushes them right off the lease and onto a neighbor's property where they feel safer.
So the quality of your hunt is diminished, even if the animal numbers are technically still there, simply because they're too stressed out to move naturally during the day.
Precisely. The solution is managing the number of hunters to manage the pressure. Lower density of hunters means lower pressure, and that means the animals show more natural behavior.
Okay, so now we're shifting from wildlife and experience to more tangible dangers. Reasons 4 and 5 are closely linked. They're about mitigating risk factors and safety issues.
Yeah, and if we connect all these threads, having too many rotating unknown hunters on your land dramatically increases the odds of a risk cascade. This includes the overharvesting and pressure we already talked about, but it hits the landowner directly through increased liability.
Liability, that's a big one.
Huge. Our sources specifically highlighted how professional leasing agencies will often offer a massive liability policy. One agency offers a $5 million liability policy to the landowner.
Wow, 5 million.
Yeah, and that detail is key. It shows you the massive financial exposure created by having all these unknown rotating groups that are part of that short-term, unregulated model.
And another big risk factor is just that core problem of having unknown hunters on the property. With a short-term lease, you have strangers.
Strangers to you, strangers to the land. You have no idea what their skill level is, if they respect boundaries, what their intentions are.
And that lack of knowledge, combined with just more people, leads directly to the fifth reason.
Yeah.
Safety. The source calls too many hunters on a property a recipe for a dangerous disaster. And while hunting is, statistically very safe, every time you increase the density of people with firearms, you increase the potential for accidents.
A professional approach recognizes that calculus. A dedicated leasing agent has to assess the property, study the layout, the terrain, the sight lines, and then set a hunter limit based on how many people can safely be there. It's a foundational part of responsible management that's just absent when your only focus is maximizing bookings.
Which brings us full circle, back to why the structure of the annual lease is so critical. It allows for this professional, data-driven process. So how do these agents actually determine that magic number?
The sources are clear this is not just guesswork. A dedicated agent analyzes several key factors to get to that defensible maximum limit.
Such as?
Well, first, they look at the total acreage. Then they consider the specific property layout, the mix of fields, timber, creeks, natural funnels, because that determines how wildlife actually uses the land. And crucially, they look at the existing wildlife population densities, often using professional surveys.
So they're building a complete picture.
Exactly. With all that information, they can set a limit that the land can physically sustain without, compromising those conservation goals or the safety protocols we just talked about.
So when you look at the big picture, the annual regulated approach seems to be the solution for every problem we've raised. It prevents overcrowding, it stops overharvesting, it maintains quality by managing pressure, and it handles the risk, liability, and safety issues.
It really does sound like a pure conservation win.
It does.
And that professional process, it feeds directly back into hunter satisfaction. That's the incentive. The source material notes that hunters generally prefer annual leases over short-term rentals. And a big part of that is because the annual structure often includes the first right of renewal each year.
And that's the key difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
That right of renewal gives the hunter that long-term connection. It fosters that hunter conservationist mindset because they know they have a vested interest in the property's health for next year.
Absolutely. And for the landowner, it's a dual benefit. They get to boost their revenue with a reliable, consistent income stream, while also knowing they're prioritizing proper management and conservation. It moves the whole relationship from purely transactional to truly sustainable. It guarantees the quality of their asset for years to come.
That just makes perfect sense.
So, if we synthesize all of this, the core takeaway for you, the listener, is that understanding the need for hunter limits reveals a fundamental truth about managing any sustainable resource. You have to regulate access and pressure, whether it's through a formal lease or some other way, to preserve both the quality of the experience and the long-term viability of the wildlife population.
Right.
Without those carefully considered limits, that quality just inevitably decays and the resource gets depleted.
That conflict we've been talking about here between maximizing short-term revenue and ensuring long-term preservation, it's a fascinating window into land stewardship. Since the sources make it so clear that short-term, high-volume rentals prioritize revenue over the resource, it raises a really important question. What ethical responsibility does a property owner really have to the wildlife that calls their land home? Especially when they're deciding between, a quick, high-volume revenue stream and a more sustainable, lower-impact long-term commitment. That's something for you to mull over as you consider the broader implications of conservation on leased land. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.